I stepped off the late-night train, the hiss of the brakes mingling with the wet bite of Oslo's winter air. My coat, heavy with damp from the sleet that had clung to the station platform, weighed on my shoulders like an anchor. I had left behind the sterile warmth of my research lab in Heidelberg, a city that never slept but never felt alive either, to return home, to a city I had once called home, though not with ease. Oslo at this hour was quiet, almost unnaturally so, the kind of silence that presses into your chest until it hurts. I pulled my scarf tighter, felt the chill creep under the collar of my coat, and tried to dismiss the dread curling in my stomach. My mother had passed 2 years ago, leaving the apartment and all its memories to my younger brother, Elias. I hadn't been back since her funeral, 6 months in which I told myself I was too busy, too focused on research, too precise to waste my energy on the past. Yet here I was, suitcase in hand, feeling each step along the icy cobblestones as if they were pulling me towards something I did not yet understand. The apartment building loomed in the fog, its bricks slick with frost, windows dim. A faint yellow glow from a street lamp spilled across the courtyard, illuminating the peeling paint of the entrance. Odd. I had expected lights. Elias, though distant, was meticulous. He would have lit the hall for my return. My chest tightened. I unlocked the front door, the keys trembling in my fingers as if they sensed my hesitation. The familiar scent of dust, cold stone, and faintly burnt would hit me first. It should have smelled like winter bread and pine, like the apartment always had when we were children. Instead, it smelled of neglect, of something sour and stagnant. I called out his name softly. Nothing. A thin echo answered me from the hallway, almost as if the walls themselves were listening, waiting. The apartment was still, save for a soft thumping sound coming from the corner near the kitchen. My heart skipped, stumbled, caught. It was rhythmic, desperate, someone struggling. I followed the sound, each step heavier than the last, each breath a sharp, visible wisp in the frigid air. Then I saw it, the door to the storage room, padlocked from the outside. My hands fumbled for something, anything to pry it open. Panic surged. This wasn't possible. Elias, my brother, my child of shared memories, wasn't reckless in this way. A muffled groan came from inside. Weak, pleading, fragmented. My chest constricted. Elias, I whispered, though my voice shook. I tried the lock with my fingers, then my pocket knife, then finally the crowbar I found abandoned by the stairwell. 3 sharp yanks, and the lock surrendered. The door swung open, and the smell hit me, ammonia, sweat, fear. Elias lay curled on the concrete floor, a thin blanket twisted around him, his nightshirt damp and dirty. His face was gaunt, lips cracked and pale, eyes half open, clouded with confusion. My heart wrenched. Time seemed to stop. I knelt beside him, shaking his shoulder gently. His eyes flickered toward me, recognition dawning slowly. Ingrid? His voice was hoarse, ragged, but it carried a note of disbelief. I swallowed hard. I'm here, Elias. It's okay. You're safe now. Lifting him was a trial. He weighed less than he should have, each movement a reminder of the weeks of neglect I had not known. His breathing was shallow. My mind raced. How long had he been here like this? Alone, abandoned? My guilt and fury collided in a violent mix. I carried him to the living room, placing him on the couch wrapped in the thick wool blanket I found in the hall closet. His body trembled, teeth chattering despite the blanket. I tore open a bottle of water and coaxed him to sip. The water ran down the corners of his mouth, but he drank anyway. My hands shook as I tried to steady him. Memories came in fragments, sudden and piercing. I saw him as a boy at the piano, fingers stumbling across scales, frustration and brilliance mingled. I remembered our mother calling us to dinner, the warmth of her kitchen, the scent of her apple tarts. I remembered the night of her funeral, Elias staring blankly at the coffin, refusing to cry, refusing to be anything but distant. And now he lay in my apartment, not my mother's anymore, but still her space, still a house of memory, diminished and trembling. I checked his pulse, his color, the shallow rise of his chest. Hypothermia, dehydration. I had no phone service here, no way to call for help until I wrapped him in blankets and carried him to the nearest street where a taxi could take us to the hospital. Every step out the door, past the darkened hallways and frost-slicked bricks, felt like carrying the weight of a lifetime of neglect and absence. The cab ride was a blur. His head leaned against my shoulder, breaths uneven, small whimpers escaping him at intervals. My hands remained clasped around his, trying to transmit what words could not: "You are not alone." At the hospital, the nurses took over with quiet efficiency. I followed them, hovering in the background, offering nothing but consent and murmured explanations. I could feel his vulnerability as if it were a physical thing lodged inside me. I had failed him, perhaps not intentionally, but certainly through absence, through the years spent in pursuit of work and perfection while he drifted into shadow. Hours passed. He stabilized. He slept under the warm glow of hospital lights, connected to IVs and monitors. And I sat beside him, listening to the machines beep softly, echoing like a slow heartbeat in the silent ward. I remembered the apartment again, the padlocked storage room, the smell, the silence. It was a horror, yes, but it was also a mirror of all the cold distance between us. I thought of the last time we had really spoken. Not exchanged pleasantries, not emails about bills or maintenance, but truly spoken, truly shared. It was years ago. I had been too busy, too preoccupied with deadlines and papers, and he had silently slipped away, hiding in the shadows of memory and expectation. When he finally woke, it was gradual. His eyes opened slowly, a flicker of recognition, and for a moment, the distance between us collapsed. "Ingrid," his voice was fragile, but steady enough. "You came back." I nodded, blinking back tears. "I'm here. I'm not leaving." He tried to sit up. I held him down gently. "Rest. You're safe now." The hours that followed were quiet, painfully intimate. I helped him drink, guided him through small meals, brushed the tangles from his hair. Every motion was deliberate, measured, a silent apology. He asked me small, scattered questions, about the city, about the weather, about our mother. I answered softly, gently. I did not speak of the storage room, of the neglect. There was no point. Memory in his current state was fragile, words of anger would only fracture him further. That night, I sat in the chair beside his bed. The snow outside fell in slow, steady drifts, a quiet white curtain across Oslo's dark streets. I thought of the life we might have had, the lost years, the lost trust. Yet I also thought of the fragile warmth we still carried between us. It was small, easily crushed, but it was there. I allowed myself to hope. Perhaps it would take time for him to remember, for us to mend. Perhaps it would never be complete. But survival was the first step. Connection could follow, slowly, carefully. And in the quiet hour, when the city slept and the machines hummed their steady pulse, I realized that hope, even fragile, was enough to sustain us both. The next morning, the pale winter light of Oslo filtered through the blinds, casting long, icy lines across the hospital room. Elias stirred, eyes half open, pupils dilated. I was there before he fully woke, tracing the curve of his brow, the hollow of his cheeks. He was awake enough to be aware of discomfort, but not awake enough to remember the full weight of the previous days. That was both a relief and a torment, knowing the horror he'd endured was etched somewhere in the dark recesses of his mind, but invisible to him now. I sat beside him in silence, watching his chest rise and fall, thinking about the times I had left him alone, the times I had left both of us alone. How many evenings had I spent in sterile labs and lecture halls while the shadows of the city pressed against our apartment walls? How many times had I called to ask about him and heard the polite but distant answer of a brother I hardly knew anymore? And yet, seeing him now, so small and fragile, I felt a surge of protective fury, a need to rewrite every missed opportunity, every failure, even though I knew I could not. The memories came unbidden. Elias at 8, sitting at our mother's old upright piano, struggling to play a sonata he could never quite grasp. I had been sitting on the edge of the couch, notes in hand, correcting fingering mistakes with a precision that was cold and impersonal. Our mother had watched, quiet, waiting to intervene, but she had trusted me to guide him. I had failed him even then, insisting on perfection instead of patience. And now, decades later, he lay in my hands, a fragile echo of that boy, someone I had loved but never truly seen. I found myself lingering on the smell of the hospital, antiseptic and faint disinfectant mixed with the subtle warmth of linen. It reminded me of another time, a hospital in Bergen, when our mother had been ill with pneumonia. Elias had cried then, though I did not notice until later, and I had dismissed it as childish fear. Fear, I realized now, had been a constant companion in his life, though I had been blind to it. By mid-morning, the nurses had stabilized him enough that I could sit in the chair beside the bed without constant anxiety. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm in my chest. It was time to confront the question I had been avoiding: why? Why had this happened? How had my brother ended up in that freezing apartment, alone, with no one checking, no one noticing? I replayed my last call to him before leaving for my trip abroad. His voice had been quiet, almost hesitant. "I'll be fine, Ingrid," he said. "Don't worry about me. I can manage." At the time, I had accepted it as reassurance. Now, it felt like the cruelest kind of deception, or perhaps the final, inevitable consequence of our neglect, the distance we had allowed to grow, unchallenged, between us. The hospital room grew warmer as the sun climbed, light sliding across the walls like silver dust. Elias moved slightly, murmuring. I leaned closer, my hand brushing his. "You're safe," I whispered. "You're here, and you're safe." And in that whisper, I understood that safety alone could not undo the past. I could not bring back the months, the years, the countless moments when I had failed to see him. But I could insist on this hour, this day, this fragile survival. And perhaps, if I tried, I could build a bridge strong enough to hold us both. Later that afternoon, the nurses allowed me to help him move from the hospital bed to a wheelchair. I was careful with every motion, measuring my strength against his weakness. He leaned on me, fragile but not fragile enough to collapse entirely, his trust a tentative thing that required constant reinforcement. As I guided him through the halls toward the exit, I noticed the pale sunlight catching the frost on the windows, sparkling like shards of broken glass. Beautiful, cold, and ephemeral, much like the trust between us. The taxi ride back to our apartment was quiet. Oslo was a city wrapped in mist and frost, streets slick and deserted, the silence heavy around us. I kept my hand on his arm, feeling the tremor beneath the thin fabric of his sweater. I thought about how life could be stolen in moments like this, how one absence, one misjudgment, could tilt everything toward despair. When we entered the apartment, the smell hit me again, not the sourness of neglect this time, but the faint warmth of winter air mingled with the residual scent of past meals, old wood, and memory. I placed him on the couch, wrapped him in blankets, and watched as he finally relaxed, eyelids heavy. Sitting there, I let my mind drift to what the next months might bring. His recovery would be slow. The winter would press against our apartment walls like a constant reminder of fragility and isolation. But perhaps, for the first time, I could bear it alongside him. Perhaps we could reclaim small fragments of our shared past, stitch them into something resembling continuity. Night fell early. The Oslo darkness was absolute, stretching across the city like a velvet curtain. I sat in the chair beside Elias, watching his breathing, feeling the pulse of life in the room. He stirred in his sleep, whispering fragments of a melody, a piano piece from long ago, half remembered. My chest tightened. He remembered, even if only in whispers. I reached out, tracing the line of his jaw, the curve of his hand. "We'll get through this," I murmured, though it sounded almost like a plea for myself. I had no illusions that the bridge between us could be rebuilt entirely. There would always be a silence, a distance, a fracture. But for now, he was here. He was alive. And in that quiet hour, with the city of Oslo cloaked in frost and memory, I allowed myself to hope. The following days blurred into a rhythm of careful attention and quiet dread. Oslo in winter was merciless, the streets slick with ice, the fog curling through the harbor like smoke from a ghostly fire. I spent mornings in the apartment, helping Elias with small tasks, drinking water, steadying him as he ate thin broth, brushing the tangles from his hair. At first, he resisted, almost instinctively, pulling back, eyes wary. I reminded myself that fear was now his closest companion, and that trust, like frost, required gradual warming. I would sit beside him for hours, my own hands trembling with exhaustion, my mind tracing the thin, fragile lines of his suffering. And always, the question returned, why did it come to this? How had a life so shared, so intertwined with mine since birth, dissolved into weeks of darkness and silence? The answer was maddeningly simple: neglect, distance, assumption, a cascade of absent attentions magnified by winter and isolation. Late one night, I found myself pacing the small living room, watching Elias sleep in the soft glow of a single lamp. Shadows from the nearby buildings flickered across the walls, like moving specters. I remembered our childhood apartment, the one in Grünerløkka, where Mother would hum as she baked bread, where I had traced the edges of his piano music with impatience and precision. I had believed myself kind then, patient, capable, and yet, in the cold calculus of memory, I saw how harsh, how absent, I had been. Elias stirred in his sleep, murmuring fragments of old melodies. I recognized the tune, one of our mother's favorites, a delicate piece she played on rainy afternoons. His lips moved silently, eyes half closed, a ghost of recognition flickering across his face. A sharp pang of guilt struck me. Even in his confusion, he clung to memory, while I had allowed years to slip past without truly seeing him. The first week passed in this rhythm. Meals, hydration, medical appointments, gentle attempts to coax speech and memory. I noticed his hands trembling more each day, small bruises forming where the cold had touched his thin skin. His eyes flickered with uncertainty, searching for someone to explain the hours, the days, the weeks. I could not. The horror of his isolation in that cold apartment, padlocked and abandoned, was too monstrous to verbalize. One afternoon, as I prepared a simple meal of rice and soft vegetables, he looked at me, and the question came. "Ingrid, why didn't anyone come?" His voice was thin, a whisper that trembled like fragile glass. I froze. The knife in my hand felt heavy, almost accusatory. I swallowed hard. How do you explain abandonment to someone whose memory fractures under stress? We didn't know, I said carefully, lowering the knife. No one realized. But I'm here now. That's what matters. He nodded slowly, eyes distant. I could see the wheels turning in his mind, fragments of events struggling to connect. And I realized, painfully, that he would never fully reconstruct the timeline, the horror, the weeks of silence. Perhaps that was a mercy. By the second week, we had settled into a tenuous rhythm. Oslo's streets were gray and slick, the winter deepening. I would leave him in the apartment for brief intervals, returning quickly, checking for signs of disorientation, fear, or weakness. Each day brought small victories, a sip of water taken willingly, a few words strung together coherently, a faint smile when a familiar song played. But with each victory came the shadow of what had been done to him. I began cataloging it all in my mind: the padlocked door, the thin blanket, the foul smell of weeks spent in confinement, the slow deterioration of both body and spirit. It was a trauma without witnesses, almost invisible, yet impossible to ignore. I could not unsee it. One evening, after settling him into bed, I walked the apartment silently, inspecting every corner, every trace of neglect. The storage room was empty now, cleaned and cleared, but the memory lingered, a hollow, gnawing ache in the chest of the apartment. I ran my hands along the walls, remembering the cold, the darkness, the silence that had pressed against him, and I felt a surge of rage so profound it almost knocked me to my knees. Why? I whispered to the empty room. Why was this allowed? And then, sharper, colder, how do I protect him from the rest of the world when the world itself has failed so completely? Sleep came fitfully. When I dreamed, it was of the padlocked room, of him shivering, calling my name in a voice too small, too weak. And always, I would wake with a start, my heart pounding, the apartment silent, the shadows long. I began to search through his past, old letters, photographs, emails, anything that might explain the growing isolation. I found messages to friends left unanswered, invitations never accepted, phone calls that went unanswered for weeks. Each trace was a reminder: he had been fading into invisibility long before the winter that brought me home. By the third week, I realized that recovery would not be measured in days but in months, perhaps years. I reached out to a neurologist specializing in cognitive rehabilitation. Every session with Elias became a delicate exercise in patience, memory games, gentle conversations about shared experiences, and repeated reassurances that he was safe. He struggled, often frustrated with himself, and I struggled alongside him, learning to let go of control, to step back, to simply witness and guide. One evening, after a particularly long day of therapy, he spoke a sentence that nearly broke me. I forgot you once. I stopped, chest tightening. My heart ached in response, and I knelt beside him, placing my hands over his. It's okay, I said softly. We're here now. That's what matters. He nodded, eyes misted with tears. And for a moment, the fragile bridge between us felt visible, real, capable of holding the weight of both our histories. Winter in Oslo deepened. Snow fell in thick, muffled layers, blanketing the streets and the rooftops in white silence. I began leaving small notes for him around the apartment, reminders of meals, of appointments, of moments we had shared. I found that the tactile act of writing, placing, guiding, restored something in both of us. Memory, I realized, was not linear, it was cumulative, fragile, and persistent in ways both terrifying and beautiful. By the fourth week, Elias had begun to speak more freely. Words still came haltingly, but each sentence carried weight, a tether to reality, a thread back to the life that had been nearly lost. One afternoon, as I helped him arrange old photographs on the living room table, he paused over a black and white image of our mother, smiling in the sunlight of her garden. She looks happy here," he murmured. His voice trembled, not just with emotion, but with the effort of recollection. "Yes," I said softly, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "She was. We had our moments. I didn't say we still have them, because we hadn't. Not yet. But I hoped we could find fragments again." He lingered on the photograph, tracing the lines of her face with his trembling finger. I watched him, noting the faint swell of emotion, the struggle to bridge memory and present, to reconcile the past with what had been done to him. The shadows of those days in the cold apartment still clung to him, thin and persistent, but he was beginning to push them back, inch by inch. That night, after settling him into bed, I sat in the chair by the window, staring at the snow-laden streets of Oslo. The city was silent, a vast expanse of white, and I felt the enormity of the weeks that had passed. I thought of the fragility of life, the suddenness with which everything can shift, and the quiet, persistent courage required to reclaim it. My mind wandered to the winter evenings of our childhood. Elias at the piano, our mother humming in the kitchen, the city outside alive with distant lights and murmurs. I realized that what had been lost was not just time or safety, but the trust we had always assumed was permanent. That trust had been fractured, nearly destroyed, yet here we were, still tethered, still breathing in the same space. I imagined the future in small increments, a winter morning with him reading the newspaper aloud, a spring afternoon walking slowly along the harbor, sun glinting off the water. I imagined evenings spent in shared silence, comforted by the simple presence of each other. I knew the bridge would never be seamless, some gaps could not be filled. But perhaps the foundation, rebuilt with patience and love, could hold. The days continued in careful rhythm. I monitored his health, ensuring he ate, slept, and moved safely. I arranged for weekly visits from a cognitive therapist, who guided us through exercises designed to strengthen memory and orientation. Progress was incremental, almost imperceptible at times, but undeniable. Elias began to smile again at familiar songs, to recognize street names, to hum melodies from childhood. One evening, he reached for my hand as I helped him into bed. I remember the piano, he said, voice barely above a whisper. I remember you. I choked back tears, squeezing his hand gently. Yes, I said. You remember me. And I'm here. Always. The winter deepened, and with it, the slow, deliberate healing. Oslo's streets, once stark and isolating, became quiet companions as we ventured outside, wrapped in scarves and coats, breathing in the crisp air, feeling the city's pulse beneath our feet. Elias leaned on me, cautious but determined, reclaiming parts of himself that had been nearly stolen. In the quiet moments, I reflected on the fragility of trust, the stealth of neglect, and the resilience of the human spirit. I thought about how easily we can overlook those we love, how the smallest absence can magnify into something monstrous. And I thought about my own role, both in failing to see him before and in committing fully to his recovery now. By the end of winter, we had established a new pattern. Mornings filled with light exercises, afternoons with reading or music, evenings spent in conversation or quiet reflection. Elias still struggled with memory lapses, and the fear of the past lingered, but the space between us was no longer defined by neglect or distance. It was defined by care, presence, and unwavering attention. One night, as I tucked him in and adjusted the blankets, he whispered, "Ingrid, thank you." I froze, holding my breath. The words were simple, almost mundane, yet they carried the weight of a lifetime of pain, fear, and near loss. "You don't have to thank me," I said softly. "I'm just here. That's all." He nodded, eyes heavy with sleep, finally still. I watched him for a long while, tracing the line of his jaw, the curve of his hands. He was alive. He was safe. And in that moment, I understood that survival was more than just physical. It was emotional, spiritual, relational. And while the past could not be rewritten, it could be witnessed, honored, and held as a testament to endurance. The snow melted slowly in Oslo. Spring arrived quietly, bringing with it longer days and soft light. We began taking short walks, venturing further from the apartment, discovering small cafes and quiet streets. Elias would sometimes pause, looking around, marveling at the city with a childlike curiosity that reminded me of who he had been before the isolation. I kept journals, chronicling his progress, noting small victories and setbacks. I wrote down conversations, remembered songs, glimpses of recognition, fragments of a life reclaimed. In these pages, I found a sense of control, a way to preserve memory against the erosion of trauma and time. And though I knew the fracture between us would never fully heal, the shadow of neglect, the echo of fear, the gap left by what had been lost, I also knew that what remained was profound, survival, connection, and the fragile, luminous thread of love that endured. One evening, as the sun dipped low over Oslofjord, casting a golden sheen across the water, Elias turned to me, his voice steady for the first time in weeks. I want to play the piano again. I smiled, a surge of emotion catching in my throat. Then we'll play together, I said. We'll start slow, and we'll play every day if you want. He nodded, eyes alight with determination and hope. And in that moment, amidst the fading light and the soft hush of the city, I realized that while the past could not be undone, the present was ours to reclaim, and the future, fragile though it might be, was still worth reaching for. I sat beside him as he played the first few tentative notes, listening to the melody unfold, tentative, imperfect, but unmistakably alive. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I allowed myself to breathe, to hope, and to believe that survival, love, and trust, once fractured, could still find their way back.